Yeah.
Which is the Onto-Omniscience Argument, which is a mouthful. So you talk about like what it is, what's going on here, and you talk about having like an interesting story with regards to like the motivations for that argument.
Right.
So what's going on here, Squared?
Yeah. So those past arguments were like developed by other people. Now we're delving into like arguments I've come up with. So if the quality
these are 10
changes,
times better, right?
Yeah. Sure. So the Onto-Omniscience argument. So I think it was Carneades, like that Greek philosopher guy who came up with arguments like God's never in danger, so God can't be courageous, and God lacks no knowledge, so God can't be clever. Because being courage requires danger, and being clever requires a lack of knowledge. So there are these good properties that God doesn't have, and I think that's a very interesting argument. And there are tons of responses you could give, like, well, you know, Jesus was incarnate and he had courage, or you could just bite the bullet and say, I don't care if God has courage or cleverness. There are a bunch of different responses you could give. One response I like to give is, hold on, just say, you know, God is courageous. God is clever. Because being courageous isn't referring to a state that you're currently in. It's based on a conditional claim. It's that if I were in danger, then I would act with valor. That's what courage is, for example. And I could say that is true of God. God, if he were in danger, would act with valor. It's just that he's never in danger. It's like, okay, the interlocutor might say, well, that doesn't seem like a good property. I say, okay, why not? Well, he never uses that property in any possible world. It's okay, so what? Well, the interlocutor at this point would have to give a principle, like, well, if you never like exemplify a property in any possible world, then it's not a good property. And okay, we're gonna ditch Carneades for now and just focus on that principle, because like you can talk with, say, a skeptic, and they will bring forth this intuition on their own that if X isn't exemplified in any possible world, then it's not a good property. You could actually just do contraposition. You could find the logically equivalent proposition that if X is a good property, then it is exemplified in some possible world. And what does that give you? Well, say the property of being God, that's good. I mean, it's defined as being maximally great. So, you know, that's a good property, which means that it's exemplified in some possible world. And hey, isn't that the first step of the modal ontological argument that gets you to the existence of God? If you don't know what the modal ontological argument is, hopefully Zach has another video on it.
If you don't know what it is, then you know nothing, and I'm just joking. It's really confusing, but it also makes sense.
Yes. Okay. For all of this, I'm going to have to assume that you have like a basic grasp, or like a pretty good grasp of like necessity and contingency in possible worlds, because I'm just going to be throwing that language around a lot for this. So
let's do it.
Yeah. So what the interlocutor at this point could say is like, okay, I'm just going to weaponize this principle and say, okay, what about a necessarily existent omniscient turtle? Okay, that's the property of being a necessarily existent omniscient turtle. That's a good property, right? So by your logic, by this principle that we've just come to, there is a necessarily existent omniscient turtle in some possible world. Therefore, a necessarily existent omniscient turtle actually exists. It's like, oh, that's kind of weird. Yeah, that's kind of weird. So what do you do? Well, I think you have to patch the principle to say that any atomic property, if it's good, is exemplified in some possible world. I think that's a very natural way of patching up the principle. Okay, what do I mean by atomic property? I mean like a property that doesn't have a conjunction in it. So if I like give the property of being a bearded president, that's actually just two properties: the property of being a president and the property of being bearded, and they are combined to make this one like molecular property. You have like the atomic property is making the molecular property. So the property of being a necessarily existent omniscient turtle is like just a bunch of different properties combined into one larger property, the atoms of which are the property of being a turtle, the property of being necessarily existent, and the property of being omniscient. Cool. So if an atomic property is good, then it's exemplified in some possible world. So that's cool. But the problem is now that gives the skeptic or the interlocutor a way of dodging this inference to God by saying, hold on, then I could accept that I could just say, you know, God's properties, his atomic properties, like being omnipotent, being omniscient, being morally good, those are all like individually exemplified, but in different possible worlds. They're not all exemplified in the same being. So we have like a necessary being. Okay, that's a good property, but like that's maybe the initial state of the universe or whatever. And then in these other possible worlds that we're not a part of, you have an omnipotent being in one, and an omniscient being in another, and a morally good being in another, or morally perfect being in the other. So that motivates. I think that's an interesting way to go about it. I actually believe being God, that's just the property of being perfect, so that is atomic. But if the skeptic goes down that route, well, can we actually give an argument from the possibility of an omniscient being to the actual existence of an omniscient being, or the property of, or the possibility of an omnipotent being to the actual existence of an omnipotent being? So that's what. So I started thinking about that, specifically omniscience, and actually during a sermon at my church, I thought of an argument from an omniscient being to the possibility of an omniscient being to the actual existence of an omniscient being. And I didn't want to lose my attention to the sermon, so I took one of those papers that are like, hey, we want to get to know you. Please fill out your name. I didn't fill out my name. I just put down the argument. And then I later, when I was home, I started thinking about what I had written. And I was under the impression that it's cheating. It's like Anselm's original ontological argument. It doesn't actually work, but it's really hard to figure out where the flaw is. I couldn't see the flaw, even though I came up with it. But I was under the impression that it did have a flaw. Does it have a flaw? Well, let me get into the argument. So the first premise is, obviously, possibly an omniscient being exists. And if you're a skeptic and you're aware of the modal ontological argument, you know that when there's a possibility premise, you gotta be skeptical, because in the modal ontological argument, what do those theists do? They snuck in necessary existence into that premise.
For the win.
Right. So we got to be skeptical. What are you sneaking in here, Squared? I'm not sneaking in anything. I'm just saying that in a possible world, there's a being which knows all truths. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. I'm not saying he's necessarily existing. I'm not saying he's not necessarily existing, just that he's omniscient. Coolio. Okay, so he knows all truths. Fun. What are some truths, Zach? I don't know, 2 + 2 = 4. That's the truth. So in this possible world, there's a being who knows that 2 + 2 = 4. No bachelor can be married. That's cool. That's cool. That's true. So that being in that possible world knows it, because he knows all truths. Now, here's an interesting truth. Canada borders America. Well, that's true. So that's in this being's knowledge, because we said all truths are in his knowledge. But that's a bit weird, because that's not a necessary truth. Actually, we could be more specific. We could like name the world, the possible world we're all in. Let's just call it at, and we could say at, like the at symbol. I read that in a paper and I thought it was fun. So at is actual. At is the actual world. That's a true proposition, and we said all true propositions are in this being's knowledge because it's omniscient. Huh. Cool. So this being in this possible world, wherever that possible world is, it knows that at is actual. Okay. Well, now we have two options. Either this being is in the actual world, that possible world that we said this omniscient being was in is the actual world, or the possible world we said this omniscient being was in isn't the actual world. Okay, so if the omniscient being is in the actual world and it knows all about the actual world, that's totally fine. I know stuff about the actual world and I'm in the actual world. Totally cool. It's just the omniscient being would know way more about the actual world than I do. Now, if we say that the possible world that this omniscient being is in isn't the actual world, then it's like sitting in a non-actual world, knowing that it doesn't exist, knowing that over there, those people in that possible world, they exist, but I don't. And that's kind of weird, because it knows at is actual and it knows that it doesn't exist in at. So how does it do that? It seems like metaphysical voodoo to posit that there's a non-actual being who knows all truths about the actual world while never actually existing in the actual world. Okay, but I could say that it's weird until I'm blue in the face. I'll actually give an argument that it's impossible for a non-actual being to know that at is actual without being in at. So for it to actually know that at is actual, it's going to have some sort of justification. It's not just guessing. Out of all the possible worlds, out of the infinity of them, it knows that at is actual. So it has like some sort of actuality detecting faculty. Is that possible? I don't think so, but we'll try and derive a contradiction from it. So possible worlds in like the modal landscape, they're all frozen. You can't change a possible world. If you make a change in a possible world, you're just looking at another possible world. So this possible world where the omniscient being is, who has his actuality tracking device focused, pointing him towards at being actual. Okay, that possible world, we're looking at it. It's a possible world, so it could have been actual. If it was actual, then what would the actuality tracking device point at? Well, possible worlds, they're frozen. Its actuality detecting device would still be pointing at, even though at isn't actual. If this possible world, other possible world were actual, then its actuality tracking device would have malfunctioned. So you can't actually have this actuality tracking device. It's an incoherent concept. Okay, cool. So that means that this second option of the omniscient being being in some non-actual possible world, we can't have that. So the omniscient being exists in the actual world. So therefore, an omniscient being actually exists. Now, yeah, that's the argument. Now, Joe Schmid from the Majesty of Reason helpfully pointed out where he thinks the flaw of the argument is. And I think he's actually correct. I think that this argument does have a fatal flaw. And that's that when we talk about all truths, we have to index that to possible worlds. Because in different possible worlds, all truths refers to different things. So like a possible world where unicorns exist, for example, it's true that unicorns exist. But in the actual world, they don't. I'm sorry if there are any unicornists in the audience, but like you're wrong. Anyways, when I gave the first premise, an omniscient being exists in some possible world, what you're probably thinking is there's a being who exists in some possible world W who knows all truths in W. But I didn't actually say that. I left it sneakily vague. So yeah, I'm sorry. I pulled the trickaroo in the possibility premise once again, but I didn't do it intentionally, so you can't get mad at me. What I did is I just said a omniscient being exists in some possible world simpliciter, and a being knows all truth. And in some possible world, a being knows all truths simpliciter. Because I didn't specify, what that automatically goes to is that in some possible world, an omniscient being knows all truths in the actual world. But once you can't accept that. That's like a really weighty premise to accept. It's kind of like accepting the premise that there's a necessary being in some possible world. You're not going to do that without some sort of justification. So it's that kind of switcheroo in the premise by not indexing the statement all truths is where this argument, I think, kind of derails. So I think it's still interesting, and I think it could still teach you a lot about how to critically analyze arguments. But at its current formulation, I don't think it succeeds.